Picture the heavy, sterile silence of the National Archives deep underground in Washington, D.C. A white-gloved archivist places a thick, dust-caked manila folder onto a cold steel reading table. The heavy cardboard cover is brittle, stained with the oxidized brown fingerprints of men who have been dead for decades. Stamped across the front, in faded but unmistakable red ink, is a single word: classified. For exactly 70 years, this specific file was a ghost. It bypassed every Freedom of Information Act request. It was hidden from historical ledgers, denied by federal spokesmen, and completely sealed away from the American public. You are about to look at a case so deeply unsettling, so fundamentally disruptive to the psychological fabric of the nation, that the FBI didn't just cover it up. They buried it alive. The file doesn't detail a bank robbery, a Soviet espionage ring, or a high-profile assassination. It details a crime that occurred in a picture-perfect, deeply unremarkable small town in 1953. A crime so bizarre, so forensically impossible, and so deeply disturbing that the federal government determined the American public simply lacked the psychological capacity to process the truth. The 70-year embargo has just expired. Today, we break the seal. Welcome to the Wayne Archive, the digital vault where we tear the redaction tape off America's darkest, most desperately concealed historical secrets. In the 1950s, under the iron-fisted rule of Director J. Edgar Hoover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation operated as a highly publicized, deeply curated propaganda machine. They loved the spotlight. They wanted the front pages of the newspapers filled with images of their sharp-suited agents taking down notorious bank robbers and breaking up gambling syndicates. The FBI built its entire mid-century reputation on the absolute illusion of control, the idea that no matter how dark the shadows grew, the federal government had a flashlight bright enough to expose the monsters. But this specific file represents the exact moment the flashlight flickered and died. When local police stumbled upon the crime scene in the autumn of 1953, the FBI didn't invite the press. They established a heavily armed, multi-mile military perimeter, confiscated every single camera in the jurisdiction, and threatened local law enforcement with federal treason charges if they ever spoke a word of what they saw. We are going to reconstruct the exact timeline of that cold October morning. We will walk through the front door of the crime scene, analyze the impossible forensic data that terrified the Bureau's top behavioral profilers, and expose the terrifying truth that the government prayed would stay buried in the archive forever. Lower the blinds, turn off the lights, and let's open the folder. To understand the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped the highest echelons of the federal government, we must meticulously reconstruct the geometry of the initial discovery. The date is October 14th, 1953. The location is an idyllic, aggressively normal suburban township, nestled deep in the heavily forested valleys of the Pacific Northwest. It was a town defined by the vibrant, optimistic aesthetic of the post-war American dream: pristine, white picket fences, heavy steel Chevrolet Bel Airs parked in asphalt driveways, and the quiet, rhythmic hum of lawnmowers on a Saturday afternoon. The epicenter of the anomaly was a standard two-story colonial home at the very end of a quiet cul-de-sac, occupied by a completely unremarkable middle-class family of four. The timeline of the impossible began with a simple, mundane observation. The local postman, a veteran of the route, noticed that the heavy brass mailbox at the edge of the property had not been emptied in 4 days. The milk bottles on the front porch had curdled into a thick, yellowish mass. At 9:15 a.m., a local patrolman was dispatched to conduct a standard wellness check. As the patrolman approached the heavy oak front door, the first sensory anomaly struck him: the absolute, suffocating silence. In a house containing 2 young children and a golden retriever, there was a complete absence of kinetic energy. The patrolman unclipped the heavy leather strap of his service revolver and slowly turned the brass doorknob. The door was unlocked. When he stepped across the threshold, he did not enter a scene of violent struggle. He entered a terrifyingly perfect, suspended animation. The Kodachrome reality of the 1950s living room was entirely undisturbed. The heavy vacuum tube television set in the corner was still radiating a low, buzzing, static heat. A half-eaten breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon sat perfectly arranged on the Formica kitchen table, the grease having congealed into a solid white wax. A woman's heavy wool cardigan was draped casually over the back of a dining chair. still retaining the physical impression of the person who had been wearing it just hours before. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no blood on the pristine linoleum. There were no defensive wounds, no shattered glass, and absolutely no signs of a struggle. The family hadn't been kidnapped or murdered in any conventional sense. They had simply mathematically ceased to exist within the physical boundaries of the home. But as the patrolman moved toward the back of the house, the illusion of the perfect American suburb violently collapsed. Behind the heavy wooden door of the kitchen pantry, the linoleum floor had been brutally torn away. In its place, descending deep into the cold, damp earth beneath the foundation, was a massive, highly sophisticated architectural anomaly. It was a subterranean stairwell, poured from military-grade, reinforced concrete, plunging into absolute, suffocating darkness. The patrolman drew his weapon, flicked on his heavy chrome flashlight, and descended. What he found at the bottom of those stairs was the exact reason the FBI sealed the file for 70 years. Beneath this quiet, unassuming suburban house was a sprawling, multi-room subterranean bunker. But this was not a standard Cold War fallout shelter built to survive a Soviet atomic blast. The walls were lined with highly advanced, unrecognizable mechanical surveillance equipment. There were massive banks of heavy reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorders, complex switchboards featuring hundreds of tangled, pulsing electrical wires, and thick, lead-lined containment cells fitted with heavy steel observation glass. The air was thick with the heavy metallic stench of burnt ozone and industrial chemicals. Within exactly 45 minutes of the patrolman's radio call, the local jurisdiction was completely, violently superseded. A fleet of unmarked matte black 1953 Plymouth sedans tore into the quiet cul-de-sac, tearing up the pristine green lawns. Dozens of federal agents dressed in sharp, uncompromising charcoal suits and heavy trench coats swarmed the property. They did not operate like standard crime scene investigators. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of a military hazard team. They immediately severed the town's telephone exchange, physically cutting the copper wires at the main switchboard to initiate a total communications blackout. They confiscated the local patrolman's heavy leather logbook, stripped him of his badge, and detained him under federal authority. The FBI didn't just secure the crime scene, they quarantined the entire reality of what was buried beneath that house. They brought in massive, heavy-duty industrial floodlights and specialized technical divisions to dismantle the subterranean laboratory piece by piece. They were staring at a highly organized, massively funded, technologically advanced operation running directly beneath the feet of Middle America. And the most terrifying realization was that the missing family wasn't the victim of this underground nightmare. The forensic evidence slowly revealed that the family had been the ones operating it. As the FBI's specialized technical division set up high-intensity, industrial halogen work lamps, the harsh white light violently illuminated the cold, reinforced concrete walls of the subterranean facility. The federal agents, operating in a state of quiet, suffocating dread, began the meticulous process of forensic cataloging. What they discovered completely shattered their understanding of domestic security. The patriarch of the missing family, a man documented in the local municipal census as a mid-level corporate actuary named Harrison Miller, was entirely a fabricated ghost. The heavy steel filing cabinets lining the walls of the bunker did not contain tax returns or suburban PTA meeting minutes. They contained highly classified, meticulously detailed psychological and physiological dossiers on every single resident of the cul-de-sac. The massive banks of reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorders were not intercepting Soviet radio broadcasts. They were hardwired directly into the local telephone exchange and the physical infrastructure of the surrounding houses. The Miller family had secretly run miles of microscopic copper wiring through the subterranean plumbing and electrical conduits of the neighborhood. They were recording every whispered argument, every intimate conversation, and every mundane interaction of their neighbors with terrifying, mechanical precision. But the surveillance extended far beyond simple audio wiretaps. The dossiers contained complex biometric data, heart rates, sleep patterns, and detailed analyses of the neighbors' reactions to specific, artificially introduced environmental stressors. The idyllic 1950s suburban street was not a community. It was a highly controlled, deeply monitored behavioral laboratory, and the Miller family were the cold, calculating handlers executing the experiment. Yet the most chilling discovery lay at the very back of the facility, sealed behind a heavy, vault-style steel door. When the FBI technicians finally bypassed the complex dual-combination lock and breached the threshold, they entered a room constructed entirely of thick, military-grade lead plating. The air inside the containment cell was stale and heavy, completely isolated from the atmospheric pressure of the outside world. In the center of the room sat a single, heavy steel medical examination chair fitted with thick leather restraints. The restraints were heavily worn, the leather frayed and strained by massive kinetic force. The interior lead walls of the cell were covered in deep, frantic, overlapping scratch marks, gouges in the heavy metal that indicated someone, or something, had been held inside this room against their will, exhibiting a level of physical strength that defied standard human biology. The behavioral profilers brought in from Quantico analyzed the forensic geometry of the bunker and reached a terrifying, inescapable conclusion. The Miller family had not been kidnapped, murdered, or forced out of their home by an invading force. The absolute lack of defensive wounds, the perfectly staged breakfast on the kitchen table, and the seamlessly locked front doors indicated a flawless, highly rehearsed biological extraction. The family had voluntarily initiated a code-black sterile abandonment protocol. Something within their localized psychological experiment had catastrophically breached its parameters. The entity or the subject they were holding within the heavy lead-lined containment cell had become structurally or psychologically unmanageable. Rather than risk exposure to local law enforcement, the Millers simply activated their extraction contingency. They stood up from the breakfast table, left their heavy wool coats on the chairs to maintain the visual illusion of normalcy for anyone looking through the windows, descended into the bunker, executed their final data upload, and vanished through an undiscovered, deep-earth subterranean egress tunnel that collapsed and sealed itself perfectly behind them. The FBI wasn't investigating a murder. They were standing inside the smoking gun of a rogue, deeply embedded domestic black ops program that possessed technology decades ahead of the federal government itself. By midnight on the third day of the investigation, the heavy, encrypted teletype machines at the FBI headquarters in Washington clattered with the final, horrifying inventory of the subterranean facility. When Director J. Edgar Hoover reviewed the forensic manifest, the reaction was immediate, ruthless, and absolute. The Bureau recognized that this incident represented an existential threat to the entire psychological foundation of the United States. It was the height of the Cold War. The American public was already paralyzed by the fear of atomic annihilation and communist infiltration. If the citizens of the United States discovered that the perfect, white picket fence suburbs they trusted so deeply were actually being utilized as heavily monitored subterranean laboratories by unknown, highly advanced phantom operatives, the illusion of mid-century safety would violently collapse. Panic would consume the nation. Neighbors would turn on neighbors, tearing up their own basement foundations in a state of absolute, justified paranoia. To prevent this catastrophic psychological unraveling, the FBI initiated an unprecedented, physically devastating cover-up. At exactly 3 a.m. on a moonless night, a fleet of heavy, unmarked industrial cement trucks rolled into the quiet, sleeping cul-de-sac. Working under the cover of absolute darkness and enforced military silence, federal engineering teams ran massive, heavy-duty rubber hoses directly through the front door of the Miller residence and down into the subterranean stairwell. They pumped thousands of gallons of thick, industrial-grade concrete directly into the underground facility. They did not remove the reel-to-reel tape recorders. They did not remove the filing cabinets or the heavy steel medical chair. They entombed the entire laboratory, permanently sealing the mechanical equipment, the biometric dossiers, and the terrifying scratch marks on the lead walls within a massive, solid block of impenetrable stone. 2 weeks later, the FBI orchestrated a controlled, highly localized structural fire, burning the colonial house completely to the ground. The local newspaper reported it as a tragic, accidental electrical short circuit. The municipal fire department, operating under severe federal threats, filed the required paperwork without asking a single question. The ashes were quickly bulldozed, the lot was leveled, and the physical footprint of the Miller family was completely eradicated from the earth. The cover-up then extended into the bureaucratic archives. The FBI dispatched agents to the local municipal records department, physically razoring the birth certificates, tax records, and property deeds associated with the alias of Harrison Miller out of the heavy leather-bound ledgers. The family was mathematically unwritten from the timeline of reality. The heavily redacted field reports, the haunting crime scene photographs of the abandoned breakfast table, and the structural blueprints of the subterranean bunker were shoved into a thick manila folder. The FBI classified the file with the highest possible security clearance, applying a draconian, unbreakable 70-year embargo. They buried the folder in the deepest, most inaccessible vault in the federal archives, praying that the men who eventually opened it decades later would view it as a bizarre, unsolvable anomaly rather than a terrifying blueprint. The ultimate, lingering horror of this specific classified file is not what happened to the Miller family. It is the statistical probability of the architecture. If an unknown, highly funded shadow organization possessed the capability to flawlessly embed a heavily armed subterranean surveillance bunker beneath a single, unremarkable suburban house in 1953, the mathematical reality dictates that it was not an isolated installation. It was a prototype. When we look back at the 1950s, we are blinded by the heavy, curated nostalgia of a simpler time. We see the gleaming chrome bumpers, the pristine lawns, and the absolute certainty of the American dream. But the unsealing of this 70-year-old classified file proves that the polished surface of suburbia was nothing more than a carefully constructed, highly monitored stage. The FBI didn't bury this file to protect the nation from a foreign enemy. They buried it to protect the nation from the terrifying realization that they were the subjects of an invisible, domestic experiment. If this deep dive into the darkest, most violently suppressed classified archives of the federal government shattered your perception of mid-century history, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Wayne Archive. We will continue to tear the redaction tape off the files they prayed would stay buried, exposing the phantoms that operated right beneath the feet of the American public. Review the forensic geometry of the bunker, analyze the psychological profile of the extraction, and drop your ultimate theory down in the comments section below. Who do you think the Miller family was truly working for? And more importantly, do you think the subterranean network they built was ever actually deactivated? Thank you for stepping into the archive with us today, and remember, the most terrifying secrets are not hidden in the shadows. They are buried right under your own home.